Ladies and gentlemen, friends, a very warm welcome to this very special Peerhead session tonight. My name is Jane Davidson and I'm the Minister with the responsibility for sustainability and climate change in the Welsh Assembly Government. But I think that I've been given the privileged opportunity of introducing our guest this evening, because when I heard he was coming, I said, I studied him back in 1975 as the father then of modern linguistics. Now, Noam Chomsky wrote a book, actually in the 50s, called Syntactic Structures, which has influenced huge numbers of people in the context of the debate about language. And there was a particular example that he used in that book, which is colourless green ideas sleep furiously. Now, I'd like to say to you that my studying of Noam Chomsky led me to a great understanding of issues around linguistics. I have to say that that phrase just became a password between a small number of students at Birmingham University at the time in terms of our particular grouping. We condensed it to CGISF. It was our restricted code, and anybody who knew that was in with our in-crowd. So sadly, I can't give you any other linguistic gems, but to say that therefore Noam Chomsky has influenced my life from the early 1970s. Interestingly enough, in 2000, he was top of the list for the University of Minnesota's top 100 of the most influential individuals in cognitive science. We are talking about a man who has had fantastic influence on language, on politics, on psychology, on other aspects of cognitive science. But interestingly enough, when I did a bit of delving, I found that he was 10 when he had his first political article published about the Spanish Civil War and the rise of fascism in Europe. He is hero-worshipped by the anti-globalization movement. John Pilger, Michael Moore, the late Harold Pinter, all are among his disciples. And it can't be that many silver-haired professors who have appeared on stage with Rage Against the Machine. The New Yorker had him as one of the finest minds of the 20th century. The New York Times describes him as arguably the most important intellectual alive. And in the last 6 months, looking at his official site, we see interviews and writings on hopes and prospects for activism, the charade of Israeli-Palestinian talks, WikiLeaks cables reveal profound hatred for democracy on the part of our political leadership. This is the most remarkable regional uprising that I can remember about Egypt. And democracy uprising in the USA, about Wisconsin's resistance to assault in the public sector, the Obama-sanctioned crackdown on activists, and the distorted legacy of Ronald Reagan. Now, this is from a man in his 80s, and that is the kind of performance and output that I think would shame most of us. So it's not surprising that he was voted the leading living public intellectual in 2005 Prospect magazine in the UK, and the New Statesman had him as number 7 of the heroes of our time. If I'd had a better internet connection coming back from Carmarthen this afternoon, I might have found out who were the first 6. But if The Guardian is right, Noam Chomsky is here tonight because of his engagement with Cardiff University Green Party and Friends of Palestine, and he'll be speaking at a sold-out event in St David's Hall tomorrow. Noam contacted the students after a 3-day sit-in a couple of years ago where they were protesting at the university's investment in arms companies, and the protest forced the university to pull the funds and invest elsewhere. He is known to be very generous with his time, answering thousands of emails sent to him every week. So, from that virtual presence to the real presence, from that global star to a local delivery, I'm delighted to welcome Noam Chomsky here to this very special session here tonight, when you have your chance to ask a world-renowned linguist, scholar, political analyst, one of the most influential intellectuals of our age, your questions. Please give a very warm welcome to Professor Noam Chomsky. Right, I'll need assistance in opening the water, but Noam, a very warm welcome here in Wales. And I just wanted to take chair's privilege this evening, if I may, and start with a question around climate change. You said that the 2010 elections in the United States could be interpreted as a death knell for the species because most of the new Republicans in Congress are climate change deniers. And you said that if this was happening in some small country, it wouldn't matter much. But when it's happening in the richest, most powerful country in the world, it's a danger to the survival of the species. With all your experience of the world, do you think that the human race can save itself from climatic disaster?
Actually, there are two major threats to survival of the species. One of them is environmental catastrophe. The other, which has been around since 1945, is nuclear weapons. And they're both very severe. The threats are severe, and they're growing in both cases. Back in 1955, Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein issued a memorandum in which they called on the people of the world to recognize that they face a choice that is stark and unavoidable. Either mankind will abandon war or the species will be destroyed. And it's come very close several times. It's actually growing today. That's one threat. The other is environmental disaster, which people weren't thinking much about in the 1950s. I have to say my own first awakening to the question was in the early 1970s when a close friend of mine, well-known earth scientist, head of the Earth Sciences Department at MIT, where I teach, showed me some new information that was coming out about issues in global warming, the consequences, the possibility of reversing it, and so on. He was pretty grim. This was early 70s. It's much better understood now, and the prognoses are much worse. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of time to do much about it. And going back to the Republican Congress, what happened, I suppose you know, is that of the new members of Congress, virtually all are climate deniers. And what makes it worse is that many of them are true believers. So, for example, the head of one of the subcommittees on the environment, the new head of one of the subcommittees, explained to the press that there can't be a problem of global warming because God promised Noah that there wouldn't be another disaster. So forget it. You know. Now that, if that was happening in, say, Monaco, it might not matter so much. But it's happening in a country where half the population believes that the world was created a few thousand years ago, exactly as it is now, with all the fossils and everything else. A third of the population thinks that every word of the Bible is literally true, and maybe 90% believe in miracles. 2/3 are expecting the second coming. it's in cross-cultural studies, it's way off at the extreme in religious extremism. Actually, this comes right back to the English colonists. And in fact, England is pretty far off the spectrum too. But the original colonists were religious fanatics. They were, waving the holy book when they were returning to they were the children of Israel returning to the promised land, killing the Amalekites the way the Lord told them, and so on and so forth. And that's remained through the Scotch-Irish immigration and right up until today. It's a large part of the population, and it never was an politically organized part until about the 1980s. What happened then is that the Republican Party, which at that point with Reagan was no longer really, it was losing its character as a political party. It was getting so deep into the pocket of major corporations that you needed a telescope to find them. There practically are no moderate Republicans left. Somebody like, say, Eisenhower or Nixon, for example, would be considered a raving leftist in the political spectrum. In fact, today's Democrats are what used to be moderate Republicans, very few exceptions. There are a lot of reasons for this, you go into them, but it has to do with changes in the economy, political changes, and so on. But it's happening, and they need a base, they need a voting base, and they've tried to organize the previously unorganized, very substantial religious extremist, we call it extremist community, into a voting base. Anyway, that's part of it. Another part, which is even more dangerous, is that the major corporations have for several years now have been openly advertising the fact that they're carrying out large propaganda campaigns to convince the population that global warming is just a liberal hoax. Now that's rather interesting. I mean, if you could pretend you're a Martian and you don't care what happens, it's intellectually interesting because the CEOs of those corporations have the same set of values and understanding that most of us have. They know perfectly well that it's real and that it's grave and that it'll destroy what they own and destroy the lives of their grandchildren. But they don't really have a choice, and that's what makes it dangerous. The position they're taking is a kind of an institutional necessity, not an individual choice. If they don't take this position, they'll be eliminated, and somebody else will come in who will do it. And the reason is that in the kind of semi-market systems that we have, not really market systems, but they have elements of market systems, that people in decision-making positions, say the CEO of a corporation, they have a duty to perform. Actually, in Anglo-American law, it's actually a legal duty, but it's an institutional duty anyway. They have to maximize short-term profit and market share. If they don't do that, first of all, it's illegal, and secondly, they'll be out and somebody else will be in. Well, if you want to maximize short-term profit and market share, you don't want regulations, you don't want interference, you want to be free to act, you don't want laws even, because you want to act in criminal fashion, which often happens. And it means that you must ignore what economists call externalities, that is, the consequences of an action for others. That's a large part of the reason why we have a financial crisis. If you're an investment banker, let's say, Goldman Sachs manager or something like that, you have to disregard what they all understand, what's called systemic risk, meaning if you initiate a transaction, you do it in such a way that it's good for you, and if there's a risk, you try to cover your risk, but you don't pay attention to the risk that the whole system will crash, and that's inevitably going to happen in these under these institutional arrangements. In fact, since the regulatory apparatus of the 30s, 40s, 50s has been dismantled, yes, you have repeated financial crises. You're going to continue to have them. Well, in that case, when you have a financial crisis, there's a way to rescue it. You go to the taxpayer bails you out. Maybe they don't like it, but that's what's done. So there's a possible answer. Goldman Sachs can make risky investments, risky transactions, make a lot of money, make a lot of profit because they're risky. When it all crashes, it's going to do, you take your copy of Hayek and Milton Friedman, you run to the nanny state and they bail you out. That happens repeatedly. Now, in the case of climate change, that's the externality in this case is the fate of the species. So when you're making decisions as a director of a corporation, one of the externalities you can't pay attention to is what's the effect on my grandchildren. You have to maximize short-term profit and market share. In this case, there's nobody to bail you out. So there's no taxpayer can come and take care of it after the crash comes. But these are institutional necessities, and that's what makes them so dangerous. It means there's no point convincing a CEO that you shouldn't be doing this. He knows it already. But if he doesn't do it, someone else is going to do it. That's just the way the institution is set up. It's the way markets work. And to the extent that we have unregulated markets, which is partial but true, you're going to get more and more of this. Well, these propaganda campaigns in the last couple of years have had a big effect. You can see it in opinion polls. By now, about a third of the population thinks there's a serious danger of global warming. The rest either outright deny it or say it's not important. And that's exacerbated by other developments. So in the midst of a serious recession, and in the United States, for a large part of the population, it's a depression. It's back to the depression. For example, in the manufacturing industry, unemployment is at depression levels, the levels that I remember as a kid in the 1930s, really serious. And worse because the jobs aren't going to come back. Because part of the economic changes, if part of it's been financialization of the economy, the other sort of corollary to that has been export of production, also for institutional reasons. You make more money that way. So the jobs aren't coming back, the depression level. People don't want to hear about things that don't matter to their immediate survival. And there are other factors that contribute. But the net effect is that a fairly small part of the population, roughly a third, thinks that this is a really serious issue. The former political party, now called the Republicans, which have no programs, nothing, just enrich the rich. That's the program. They don't want climate change. On top of that, climate change concerns. On top of that, there's the religious element, the subcommittee chair who says God promised Noah and so on and so forth. All of this is combining to lead to direct policies. You can read them in the newspapers every day. The new Congress has cut off funding for the international organization that deals with climate change. They're virtually eliminating the Environmental Protection Agency. And just to show you how politics has changed over the years, that was introduced by Richard Nixon. He was the last liberal president. Ever since then, there hasn't been a liberal president, literally. One of his liberal in the U.S. sense, kind of social democratic. This is one of a number of such initiatives of his. This is being chipped away, virtually destroyed, the regulatory system and so on, and there are many other examples. Well, that has consequences. One of the consequences is it is potentially a death knell for the species. There's no way to resurrect the destruction if this continues. It's not like systemic risk in the financial system where you can get a bailout from the taxpayer. No bailouts in this case. And it's a combination of institutional problems, which mean that the institutions are going to have to change if there's a way out of this, and other factors, such as the ones that I mentioned, they're combining in a very dangerous way. So it's kind of a race, I think. If some Martian were watching what's happening here, they'd be laying bets on which way the human species is going to destroy itself. There's two competitors. One is nuclear weapons, the other's environmental catastrophe, and it could well be one or the other. Actually, there's a rather grim forecast if you want to know it. But,
so I think the answer was no. Thanks for that. I mean, I think the globalization, markets, poverty, nuclear weapons, there is a huge amount for us to talk about tonight.